First of all, Cameron, great job on your paper. It was outstanding.
Thank you.
And your topic was really something that I could relate to as I shifted from the education sector to the healthcare sector, and I thought, what am I doing? You know, and that imposter syndrome, the topic really was. I mean, it hit home. So, and that's great research. So, I'm really looking forward to this this presentation. You've done an outstanding job on your research. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I'm happy I can be there in Zoom. So, take it away.
That's quite all right. Thank you, Steve. So the presentation I have today is called Finding Your Voice, and it's about the quest for confidence in legacy performance by way of mentorship and the imposter syndrome. So a brief overview of everything we're going to be talking about today. I'll share a formal introduction, go through the methodology of the research that's been conducted. I then have both a literature review and some case studies to present. We'll then go into the results and the discussions, followed up by my recommendations. And then I'll also have some time for limitations, reflections with the 3EO, and we'll wrap up with a couple long slides of my references. So as we go into the introduction, I just thought it made sense for me to share a little bit about myself. I'm a graphic designer and a puppeteer, and have always been interested in how characters are passed down in storytelling. That's what Christina and I talked about over a year ago when I went into her office hours to talk about this project, and it's, like I said, what got us here to today. So as we talk about this leadership studies and imposter syndrome and mentorship, I want to look at it through the lens of legacy characters. And what I mean by this, and this is the definition that I use in the paper, is characters in film and television that are carried throughout a brand's history, often bridging the gap between generations of audience to maintain continuity for their respective beloved franchises. So an easy example of this is something like mascots for companies, you know, Monopoly Man, Ronald McDonald. These are all characters that, you know, I grew up with, my mom grew up with, in some cases my grandparents grew up with. And when these characters are portrayed in storytelling on film and television, we expect when they're portrayed by human actors, that as time goes on, in the case with Mark Hamill here, or oh my gosh, I'm forgetting who plays Wolverine. It's okay. But as the human actors age, those characters age as well. And this is not the case with characters that are also played by humans, but are physically inanimate. So we're talking about cartoon characters and puppet characters. And as those actors, I should say, pass the torch to the next generation, there's a lot of things that these new performers have to deal with, whether that be public scrutiny, internalized pressure, you know, just pressure that they put on themselves. Oftentimes the grief of losing the person who had performed these characters before. A lot of times these transitions only happen when someone has passed away. And no real structured support. These systems aren't really built to have anyone but one person playing these roles. So a lot of this you know, sort of serves as a microcosm for all kinds of legacy transitions, whether it's you know, in workplaces, any kind of transfer of power and position. And this is where we see the imposter syndrome rear its head. This persistent self-doubt, despite evidence or competence. Despite evident competence. So, good example is the fact that I'm nervous today, even though I've done all the work and feel very confident about things. I still feel like, you know, at any point someone's going to say, no, you don't get a master's for this. And this is where mentorship can counteract those feelings. Mentorship being a proven strategy to mitigate imposter syndrome. And my goal with this thesis was to explore the relationship between these two factors, applying it to the idea of legacy performance, but also have a call to action for further academic research, and we'll get into the why of that, and then propose revised mentorship framework for any kind of creative or professional succession. So how did I do all of this? I reviewed 36 academic sources across education, medicine, and the creative arts, as well as identified 3 case studies, which was supplemented by industry interviews, primary media content, and the rest, to kind of help fill in. You're not going to find too many academic papers on Kermit the Frog, so I had to go elsewhere for some of that info. So what did the literature tell us? The imposter syndrome was coined by Clance and Imes in 1978 to explain high-achieving individuals who feel self-doubt. This is characterized by the feeling of being exposed as a fraud, being too precious and perfect and overworking yourself in these repeating cycles, and then also discounting praise when it's given to you and overemphasizing critique. It's ignoring all the good stuff and amplifying all the bad. And this affects both men and women, and it is also exacerbated in marginalized communities or where there's intersectionalities happening, but it could happen anywhere to anyone. Fortunately, mentorship, specifically positive mentorship, is able to build confidence, provide validation, and it normalizes these challenges by letting people know that, oh, I felt that too. These shared experiences are really valuable in understanding you're not alone and you can keep on persevering. Where poor mentorship comes into play is that it just reinforces all these self-doubts and criticisms over and over again that we were talking about when that support is not there. And now we see a lot of places, and this is what a lot of the literature backed up, is that the structured mentorship is kind of what makes all the trains run on time in fields like medicine and education. You see that with student teaching programs and with the whole sort of hospital hierarchy of interns, residents, attendings, all that sort of stuff. That's what I have in that first bullet. Residencies and student teaching foster resilience and a professional identity. You get to see the ups and downs of these fields. It's a structured mentorship that reduces these self-doubts. It allows for highly qualified teachers and educators and medical technicians. And this workplace atmosphere and peer support curb this incoming imposter syndrome. All this being said, this is kind of an early limitation of my research was the fact that pretty much 10-to-1 any case talking about mentorship or imposter syndrome in a novel professional field, there would be, like I said, 10 or more studies in the medical industry or in education. So because these industries are inherently, they like to navel gaze a little bit. So that's where a lot of this work has come from, and that's part of why there's a call to action for further research. So let's look at some of the case studies that I looked at. For the case of Kermit the Frog, this was a character created in 1955 by Jim Henson and was performed nearly 30 years, over 30 years, nearly 40 years, until Jim passed in 1990. It was posthumously reassigned by Henson's children. After Henson's death, he did not have any kind of contingency plan for what would happen when he passed away. But in the case of Whitmire, this is someone who worked with Jim for a very long time, aside and next to, and really benefited from the direct mentorship, as well as the archival study that he did. He had hours and hours and hours of video footage of Jim performing these characters that he was able to then study for reference. When Kermit was then recast about 9 years ago, in 2016, Whitmire himself was ousted for some controversy and brinksmanship and kind of being a poor team player, and he was succeeded by Matt Vogel, another puppeteer, without this same level of direct mentorship. There was no plan for Vogel to be taking on this character. He had no sense that that was in his future, and especially because this transition happened in the internet age, he was faced with a tremendous amount of online scrutiny and continues to face a lot of fan skepticism in just about anything that he does. So definitely two different kind of issues that these men faced. In the case of a transition with Miss Piggy, this is kind of curious because when the character first debuted on The Muppet Show in the late 1970s, she was shared throughout the first season between Richard Hunt and Frank Oz, who eventually decided, oh, we'll give this role to Frank. But for that first year of her existence, there was an uncertainty of who was going to be performing this character that ended up becoming the Muppets' breakout star. And again, when for a long time, Frank performed this character then on his own, but as he started to become a film director, it really impacted his attendance in being able to perform the pig throughout the 1990s. So at that point, the Henson Company decided that they needed essentially a substitute Piggy, which is where Eric Jacobson came into the fold around 2001, and they realized pretty quickly that in order to keep their one character, one performer ethos, that Jacobson would assume full responsibility for the role in 2002. He really didn't have any formal mentorship in this case. He had never really worked with Oz before. He was able to learn from observation and study, but did not have any kind of real handoff besides, make sure you're focusing on your diction. At the same time then, years later, once Jacobson was very well established in this role, Oz continues to come out in the press and sort of negatively criticizes modern portrayals, which sort of adds tension to this transition, especially for people who only see Muppets in newspaper headlines. So there's kind of this undercutting that continues to happen. So the third character I looked at was Mickey Mouse, because I didn't want to just focus on these puppet characters, and Mickey, certainly is an important icon in this case. The original Mickey Mouse was performed by Walt Disney, whose role in his own company eventually made his schedule untenable to get in the voice box and record for the mouse. Walt lived until 1966, but he gave up the role in 1947 and passed it on to Jimmy McDonald, who was a trusted sound engineer at the studio. So when it was passed on to McDonald, he performed Mickey until his retirement in 1977, and then the role passed to another Disney sound engineer, Wayne Allwine, who had the longest tenure so far as Mickey, performing it from 77 to 2009. And especially in this transition, though also in the Disney to McDonald transition, we saw a close mentorship. Really, Allwine considered it a stewardship of taking on this role, and there was a very sort of seamless thing happening. What's curious is that since then, in 2009, the role was sort of blind cast. They didn't have any kind of successor set up, and they found Brett Ivan, who formerly was a Hallmark greeting card writer. Not to knock that profession, because that sounds great. But he didn't have any direct mentorship with any of these previous individuals, had never even met McDonald or Allwine. So, but he embraces the legacy component to it. But also, since 2013, Disney has hired a second performer, Chris Diamantopoulos, I think is how you pronounce his name, who performs sort of a different version of Mickey. So, Iwan performs Mickey for apps and games and areas where Mickey is the product, versus Diamantopoulos, who performs him in anytime Mickey has to really act, because he is a formal actor and has some more capabilities in that kind of performance. So it's a very rare case, all this said, it's a very rare case of dual casting on Disney's part, which reflects both a reverence for the tradition, because Diamantopoulos is really doing things in a way that reflect what Walt had established almost 100 years ago. But it also is very much a break from tradition in the sense that we have two guys doing it all at once. Quick sub-note about Mickey. In total, there have actually been 18 voice actors who have lent their talents to performing Mickey throughout, like I said, his 100-year history. But most of those other 13 cases have been like literally when one of those first three guys were sick, and they would just say, oh, we need him to say one little thing real quick in a video or a commercial. So those are very much outliers. These main five guys who I've talked about are the true torch holders, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention this as well. So what does any of this mean? So from a mentorship standpoint, we definitely see that smoother character transitions result from these mentorship relationships. We saw a much higher performer confidence and also public acceptance of transitions like McDonald to Allwine or Henson to Whitmire. From an imposter syndrome standpoint, the absence of this mentorship definitely fuels imposter syndrome. And I've had the privilege of talking to Jacobson and Vogel on a podcast that I hosted with Adam Krutinger, and they all talk about things like insecurity, the public pressure, and an artistic isolation, and the fact that there have only been one or two people who have done this before them, and they don't have that confidant that we talked about in the beginning as being something that is so vital in dissuading imposter syndrome. And then there's also the very real component of these characters being owned not by the performers who perform them, but on a company that could decide to do anything they want with them. All three of these characters are now owned by the Walt Disney Company. Mickey Mouse in particular illustrates this sort of corporate pragmatism ahead of any kind of true artistic integrity, as this role fluctuates between a very sacred responsibility or just what gets the job done quickest and cheapest and most effectively and will have the highest return on investment. So as I kind of synthesize these results, certainly mentorship plays a huge part in this. These performance-based professions have unique challenges that are really difficult to codify and pass down. We have interviews and other video records and things like that, but unless we're writing it down or like truly passing it on, it's all going to be lost to these generations. These transitions are very high pressure, in large part because they happen rather infrequently, and with very little structural support. Like I said, there's not really a guide for any of this. And then there's also this duality that happens, the corporate needs versus the performer identity, the sacred stewardship versus brand utility. And there are certainly parallels here to the medical and education fields that I looked at in the literature reviews. Medicine and education can offer very replicable models, things that have clear expectations, are high on feedback, and allow for this kind of emotional regulation that someone would need at these transition points in their lives. But very much further research is an important part of this. We need more of it. We need more navel-gazing in more novel fields to get a better sense of where the specific things are. Because whether or not you're a graphic designer or an animator or a puppeteer or any of these things, you're not a doctor or an educator. And we all have very unique things that are specific to our industries that we need to know better about how do we pass this on to the next generations. So it's really important to see what's happening in these unique strains. So some recommendations that I came up with as we begin to wrap up is definitely a call to formalize mentorship in entertainment. And I don't think it has to happen solely in these roles where the most famous characters in the world are passed down, but even things like stepping into the director's chair or finding your place in a set to begin with. There's a lot more that we could be doing in terms of psychological support, sharing institutional memory, and getting it out of the realm of just behind the scenes gossip. Making sure that these performers have a creative agency and being able to do the work and not be dictated by any kind of corporate or higher players. And also peer support networks, letting people know that even though you're in different roles, I still see you, I'm still feeling what you're going through. And then we also need to, getting specific to these character transitions, building more holistic models for these transitions. Let people know if they are potentially in line for any of these positions. You have the technical skill already. How do we do the emotional prep work that you need? We also need to be better about normalizing the imposter syndrome and reframe it as a striving for perfectionism and reframe it as a part of the growth. It's not a failure. And we also just need to look at these structured fields, again, like education and medicine, and adapt it for any kind of creative professions. So the limitations of all of this work, it was purely a literature review. There was no original field data, with the asterisk that a lot of the interviews that I used and cited for this project were conducted on the podcast that I hosted for a number of years. But we weren't asking these performers about mentorship and imposter syndrome. They're just things that came up. So to better do this, I would have conversations specifically about these sort of times of transitions. And there's certainly opportunity for expanded research across more disciplines and other databases. So as I reflect on what all of this means, as I said in the beginning, I've had a lifelong love of strong characters and their integrity over time. It's what motivated me to do this. I have always been a Muppet kid. I've always looked up to the performers who create those characters and really root for the people who are handed those characters and passed down to make sure that those lines of integrity and transition are not broken over the years. So what this project has really enabled me to do is have a much stronger vocabulary for what is happening here. Things that I kind of knew or felt inherently, but couldn't couldn't label. It's kind of like going to therapy of like, I know I'm feeling this thing, but you know, I need someone to help me articulate it. And this project has certainly done that in understanding these transitions. It's been, like I said, very empowering and insightful, because for as much as these people have been characters in my coffee table books and my documentaries that I've watched since I was 4 years old, they're just guys. They're just people, very fallible people, and they need support, and their mentees need support. So what am I doing with any of this? I'm very much now taking the next steps to write and produce this original film that I've alluded to. It's specifically about legacy performers in the wake of a show creator's passing. And I was really lucky a couple of weeks ago to get a scene. So yeah, I had this really great opportunity to present this and get notes and feedback from people who have been in the room when these transitions have happened. Anyhow, yeah, and I'm working with my co-writer. We're having weekly accountability sessions to turn out the script and flesh out these characters. So here's the fun part, all of the nice research that's gone on, and I'm happy to have any questions or conversations following up from everything that's just presented.
Hey Cameron, I just want to say, outstanding job. That was a great presentation. Your work is really, I think it really lends itself to a lot of different sectors. There's a lot of people that shift gears and go from one field to another that would be really valuable to. So I don't have any questions because I learned so much from not only the presentation but from your paper. It's just a really well done piece of research, so congratulations on that.
Thank you so much, Steve.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Maybe first an observation and then a question. And this is Christina speaking. I'm sitting back in the far side of the room. This feels like the story of the characters and what happens behind the characters is very much akin to what happens in life.
Yes.
So we all have transitions,
Mm-hmm.
and we are stepping into spaces where we may not be comfortable,
Right.
and we might not have that mentor, and then we might wind up feeling that sense of imposter syndrome. In this process where you're developing your production, have you given any thought to how this might be consumable by broader audiences, because everybody relates to this,
Yes.
the characters, and it almost feels like it's got a vibe, and I'm going to pick on something that's iconic that people still talk about.
Mhm.
Who moved my cheese when it comes to change? This, you might have the kernel of something here where you could create a film that has this stickiness that
Yes.
would help all of us learn these principles through the experiences of the characters.
Yeah, and that's definitely a goal. In any kind of writing, you have to ask yourself at the beginning of a project, like, why this time in a person's life, in a character's life? What can the audience learn from this? And a dear friend and mentor of mine who was at the O'Neill asked me this year, she said, well, who is this film for? Before I presented anything to her, and I said, anyone who's ever worked an office job and has gone through any kind of transition. I think the puppetry and this element of having a physical character to represent and be this totem for a chair in an office, and who sits in it, and who's turning on the lights and who's pulling the levers, all these things, that in the same way that I could watch a movie like Sideways, having no interest or background in wine consumption, and really appreciate the topic, but more so the characters who are in this world. My backdoor plan is, that people will have more appreciation for this world of television puppetry and theatrical puppetry, but it really is, the heart of it is what's happening to these people, what they're going through emotionally, and how they're butting up against imposter syndrome. So that's very much on my mind about it not being too up its own head about the setting.
Thank you. And
Thank
then
you.
the other thing, the system, I guess I'm kind of curious as to what you found with the system, because it sounds like some of these changes are well orchestrated and some are not. Were there any differences or similarities that led to a particular type of succession orientation?
Yeah, so it's intriguing because there were both messier and cleaner case studies that I looked at that I initially had highlighted in that section. My draft that I had from 540 back in December excluded Miss Piggy and was rather about Elmo, which was it was an equally quick transition to the Henson-Whitmire transition in the sense that it happened after a very quick firing of someone, but the person had worked with and kind of done some mentorship under this character. And there's also been times a character like Big Bird, for instance, was understudied for about 25 years before it was handed off. And that was a very clean transition. I shouldn't say clean, but it was a very gradual transition is what I meant to say. Because the person who had his hand over his head for 30 years up to that point, when he was 60, 65, they said, "You're going to retire soon, right?" And they hired a young 20-something-year-old to be the understudy, and Carol continued to do it for another 20 years. So that happens as well. So again, that's another limitation of I could only write about so much before it was more paper about television history than imposter syndrome. But there are definitely different cases, like I said, messier cases, cleaner cases that I definitely do think can work in building some of these recommendations that I concluded the paper with.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions? Is there anyone that's raised their hand on your Zoom?
I don't think so.
Did you have some
Let me
friends
double
that-
check. Oh, bunch of chat. Let's see. Oh, very nice comments. But yes, no, we're good. I think we're all set. Well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate it.